and they can come to. So some of you may have seen a version of this because I presented part of this last year for the ARES conference. So there was a quick practice session, which was a short cut down version, and then at the conference, but I don't think there might be many people who've overlap, but also this is extending this out into an additional set of issues in terms of looking at these hybrid choice models, which didn't get covered last time. But there's some context which should be familiar with people who were here before. Joint work with folks from Manchester, Dan, who's here in the room, but Catherine Payne and Zachary Payne-Thompson, who were working on the big project that, that this was part of. So, just start off, why hybrid choice models? We're going to introduce this at the moment, and then it's going to disappear and reappear in about 20 minutes. But just to start off as to what are these things called hybrid choice models? Well, when we're estimating these types of models, trying to explain their choices in our surveys or whatever, we quite often want to explain their choices based upon something about the individual, not just about the attributes of the choices they've given, but something about them. So their attitudes and their perceptions are quite often used. So the issue with those is that these things are strictly not observable. It's something which is inherent, internal, inside people. You can't actually go and measure it. So, but we try to do that with these proxy questions, and quite often we have a bank of proxy questions which might be measuring their risk aversion or something similar to that. But it's not actually their risk, it's a proxy for it. And the issue is that those variables are now almost by definition measured with error, because we're using proxies to measure. But we're going to still put them into our models. And potentially having these proxy variables measured with error can lead to biased estimates, and it can possibly lead to over-precision in the estimates, over-precision of the estimates. So you're more confident in what the parameter is than you should be. So this is the context we want to actually apply a hybrid choice model. It's not moving. Why is it not moving?
Sharing the screen rather than the application.
That's what I did.
You can make it full screen.
Hang on. So we were on a roll. Last week it went perfectly. I want to do a window. I want to do that, which is just, are you getting the full window now?
Oh, yeah, you got the right border now.
No.
It wasn't there before.
You enlarge it, make a full screen.
We're doing the app instead of the window. Well,
Am I moving? No. Okay.
that's the wrong one. You did the app instead of the window. Do the window.
Or entire screen.
Entire screen.
Entire screen.
That one, you think?
Yes, this one.
Okay, I'm not going to go back because you can see the first one. This is the one. So, where was I? So the application here is for a hybrid choice model where the unobserved variable, this proxy, this for attitudes of perception, is key to what we're interested in looking at. So is this an issue? Okay, what's the context? So this goes back a fair way. So this is work, again, with Dan, but also with Catherine, where we were asked to do some work for the FSA, Food Standards Agency, in the UK, looking at the willingness to pay to avoid foodborne illnesses. And that led to, that work went into their estimates of the burden of foodborne disease. And then they came back and said, can you do this again, but look at this idea of food hypersensitivities, which are sort of strictly not a foodborne disease, but it's a response that people have to their food. So this was sort of a re-establishing the team and going back and looking at a different aspect of food and problems. What are these food hypersensitivities? Well, they got split up into three elements. There were allergies, there were celiacs, because that's a large issue in the UK generally. So that one came out as a separate issue, and then also intolerances. There was a big survey. It was adults and also parents about their children. I'm not going to talk about the parent stuff, but these are all people who've got the condition. So they understand what it means to have one of these three hypersensitivities. So one of the questions is, well, how do you measure this? As in you're allergic to something, you're sensitive to a food. That's not like, it's not, quite often it's not actually a medically diagnosed condition. It's something which is self-reported. As in I eat something and I feel a bit upset and I avoid it or whatever. So there's a question about how do you actually classify whether or not somebody's got the condition. Then also, how severe is it? If you break your leg, you've broken your leg. For this, is this a mild irritation or is this something which lays you out for 3 or 4 days if you eat the wrong food? So there are these big banks of questions which are used to basically try to define and get the severity of the condition you've got. So this is the FAQ one, which is the allergy one. It's the life questionnaire for adults. There's 29 of these items. I'm only going to show you the first, whatever that is, 6, 7. And they just ask this question, always be alert to eating. And if I'm scoring extremely on all of these, then it implies this is having a significant impact on my life. The celiacs, different set of questions. I feel limited by this disease. I feel worried about increased risk of cancer, limited in what I eat, and so on. And again, different score. This one's on 5, not 7, but the same idea. Somebody in the room. Not me. Might have their microphones switched on. Okay, good. I'm assuming, Dan, what you're doing is you've logged on so you can send difficult questions through to Chi to ask me anonymously. Is that what's going on? Is this the process? Okay. So again, high scores on that, it's a big impact on you. And this is the one for FIC. Again, there's 18 items, a different panel of stuff. Are you worried that the ingredients of a product are going to change? About the impacts on your health, embarrassed by reaction in social, whatever it might be. So we get these sort of big banks of questions which they ask, which have been sort of standardized and set up. So what's our approach to this? Well, we just set up a standard discrete choice experiment and we offered these people 2 options, hypothetical options. Option A, it's their rest of their life in their current condition. Or option B, we're going to give you a period of relief. So in this example, 3 years, don't have the condition, then the rest of your life you go back to what it is you've got, but you have to pay for as the pill, as in order to do this, to sort of trigger this change. So obviously hypothetical, such pills don't exist, but just we're setting that up as a system. So we don't try to moderate the degree of intensity, it's either on off, because these are such sort of complicated conditions to deal with. So the usual thing, they see lots of these, or a whole bank of these, 9 of these they see out of a full design. Here's something, they're giving 10 years relief. You've got to pay for 2,500, one-off payment to get the pill. Sample, these were sort of potentially quite difficult to draw from. It was done in part through online market research, but also through the support groups for people who've got this, so that we actually could get a reasonably big sample. Okay, estimation. You could do the simplest possible model would say that the utility that people are using when they're confronted by this question is, well, there's a utility associated with the status quo of staying as I am, so that's just the status quo component, or the utility from the option B, which is the cost in years. So hopefully they don't like paying money and they'd like more years of relief from the illness. So that would be the simplest way that you could possibly think about doing it. But we know that people are different. They've got these different levels of the condition. We'd assume that actually the severity of their condition is going to affect the way that they're going to respond to answer these questions. So what we'd expect to see is that if we've got this measure of severity from this FAQ-LQ, this index score, which is just basically an average of all those 29 questions, that possibly that value might influence the way I think about the status quo, because that's what I'm going to stick with. I've got a severe condition. That's presumably not going to be very happy for you to stay there. And it might also influence the way I think about extra years of relief. If I'm under a really bad condition, then you giving me more years of relief is going to look much better, as in a year isn't a year. This is a year of really fabulous life, but I've got a poor condition. or not much if it doesn't really affecting me. So we might expect to see that these that the conditions that I'm in might affect the way that I think about my current life and how I might think about getting extra years of relief. So remember, this severity index is this big chunk of 29 questions, and we're just averaging them, and the average of all that score is going to be some sort of measure of the severity I've got. So it's clearly not a exact measure. It's some sort of proxy. So you could just pop the fact scores in as variables into the choice model, which is what most people would normally do, conventional, apart from up to about, whatever, 10 years ago when the hybrid model started to emerge. You just calculate the index, treat it now as if it's a known variable, like their age or something like that. Just put it into the model and off you go and estimate things. But all sorts of problems with these, as in the scale on which people are answering these, in some sense arbitrary, and it's all very discrete. Interpretation is subjective, it differs across people. They may want to avoid the endpoints. So there's definitely, you can't assume that this beautiful number that I've generated just by taking an average of numbers they've given me is actually going to be a measured without error measurement of their condition. So this leads into the hybrid models. So the hybrid models say, well, utility is treated as a latent variable. We don't assume that we can measure or we can observe your utility as a result of you consuming a good. We treat it as a latent variable which then causes behavior. So conventionally, if you have a choice between two goods, we say that the one that gives you the highest of this unobserved latent called utility, that's the one you pick. So we're quite comfortable with assuming that behavior is driven by these unobservable things, and then we have some sort of proxy for them. And in the utility framework, the proxy is that we understand what their utility is actually by their choices, that we infer something about utility from what they choose. So why not treat illness severity in the same way? So there's going to be basically no real equations in this. It's all going to be diagrams. So this is how the latent variables and the hybrids get set up. This is the conventional discrete choice sort of experiment part of the setup. There's this unobservable thing called utility. It's determined by these explanatory variables, which are usually the attributes of the choice sets we've given them. In our case, it's going to be cost and years. Those are the things which determine utility. And then they process that into utility, and then they make choices with a bit of an error. Well, let's assume, or we're going to assume, that they were doing the same thing when they were answering our indicator scores. So they do have this underlying sense of the impact of this condition on their life. They've got all these indicators. The little blue box is just all of those 29 questions in this case that they've answered. So we're just going to infer that the answers they gave to those indicator questions were being driven by this underlying unobservable measure of their condition, which is the index. There's lots. I've only put 3 little downward sloping arrows in here connecting index to indicators. There should be 29 of those because there's one of these for every one of the questions they've answered. So we're abandoning the idea that we can just average out all of these indicator questions. We're saying each one is going to be treated on its own, and we're going to explain the answer they gave based upon this unobserved latent, which I'm going to call an index, but it's some sort of severity condition. So you could think about these two things as being happening separately, and you could estimate them separately. And then you just say, okay, I'm going to make this condition actually be one of the things that affects the utility associated with the choices. So I can just draw an arrow between the two. Your condition, which I've now inferred from the way what you answered about the indicators, is now going to have an impact on the utility, which is going to affect the choices you make when you're in the discrete choice experiment. And the actual models we're going to use, that's just going to be treated as a standard conditional logit model. It's just binary choices, 2 alternatives. And this one's going to have to be an ordered logit model, because if you remember, they were giving us a score from 0 to 6 on this one, and those are ordered, but you might not want to think that going from barely to slightly is sort of twice as bad. It's just ordered rather than numerical variables. So we're going to put some ordered logit relationships in there. Okay. What do we get out of this? Well, this is just the results for, I'm going to go through all three, but this is the one for the allergies. So cost is negative, always a good thing. First thing you want to check for. Actually, these people did respond that if we asked them for higher prices, they were less likely to sign up. That's good. Remember, years is numbers of years free of the condition, so we'd like that to be positive. It is. And then we have this interaction variable between years and condition. So what we'd like to see is that I value years free, the higher the index value, as in the more I am affected by, the greater impact this condition has upon me. And it is, and it's on the cusp of significance, but it's still in the model. So those are sort of sitting in the way that your priors might expect you should be seeing this running through. And then you've got this ASC. So the ASC is the value that I place upon my current condition. ASC itself is positively valued. So that's quite interesting. What that means is that they have a tendency to want to stay in their current condition. In order to get them out of their current condition and agree to sign up, I'm going to have to give them a lot of years of freedom from the condition before they're actually willing to make the change. So it's a bit like a stasis effect. It's like an inertia that in some sense they'd rather stay with their condition until you can give them a big bump in terms of years of freedom from the condition. We'll come on and we'll see in a minute as to what this means. Because it also depends upon the index. So the ASC depends upon the index, so that as the severity of the condition is impacting you, then the less stasis you have. So people who have a very high sort of concern, or the index has a high value because it has a high impact on them, they are going to have less of this stasis effect. It's going to offset. You're going to see in a minute attack reduced to. We also have to estimate we also get an estimate of the variance of the index. In normal models, we would just impose some restriction, like we would standardize everything so there's Z variables with a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. Here, the model has to estimate for you what that index value is, the variance is, and that's just our sample size. No, it's the variance of the underlying condition, the underlying latent. There's a distribution of this condition in the population. It follows has a distribution, and that's a measure of its variance. Its mean is set to 0, but it says how variable is this thing. Rinse and repeat. You do this for the two other conditions, and the pattern's pretty much the same. For the celiacs, actually, there was no interaction between the condition length and the value they put upon years. But for FIC it is, but we're still getting this stasis effect is turning up everywhere, and we're also nicely getting the effect but the stasis effect isn't that strong if you end up with if your condition is more painful to you. Okay. So now you can start thinking about working out our normal process, willingness to pay. What's the willingness to pay? Well, it's the amount that I'm willing to pay. What I'm presenting here is the amount I'm willing to pay to get an extra symptom-free year. And what you can see is that it depends upon the measure of the index. And so now I have normalized this. So although it was S saying I've got this measure of the underlying condition, mean of 0 and a wide range, now I've standardized it. So I actually say it's got this distribution in the population, it's got a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. So we can compare these things across the different models, and you have an interpretation. Z equals 1 means that I'm 1 standard deviation away from the mean. I'm 2 standard deviations. There's hardly anybody up at that part of the distribution, but there's a few people who've got this really high level of the condition. So what are we seeing? Well, we're seeing what we'd expect to see was that those who have got a high value for the condition are willing to pay a lot. They're willing to pay $1,000 in order to get out of this condition for a year. The bars are just the confidence intervals, statistical confidence intervals. And as the severity of the condition goes down, the willingness to pay declines. If you're at the median, you're at about 550 in terms of what you're willing to pay. You can get all the way down into the tail of the distribution as to what I'm willing to pay for a year. I haven't shown the ones where it cuts zero and basically they're not significant. So I'm only showing you the positive ones. So that's interesting. It's what actually you might think you might want to do for policy purposes if you want to work out what is the value of the pain and suffering that people are having, that they're currently having and experiencing in the population. We're not talking about trying to introduce an intervention to get rid of it. We just want to know how bad is this for people, as in what is the cost burden of this condition in the population. These are the numbers that you'd want to use. If you've got some idea about the distribution, then you would obviously you wouldn't be saying that everybody is suffering at $1,000. If you want to take a midpoint, it's a 550 for every case of a food allergy per year. But we've got this ASC thing floating about, which is inertia. So how should we think about that, and how does that get included? Well, you can think about, let's say there's somebody trying to develop a treatment, and they want to know, well, can I actually sell this product to people? Depending on what its attributes are and what it can deliver, what actually would the market bear? And for that, I need to have the ASC effect, because basically you're saying, I'm going to come in, I'm going to offer a treatment, I've got these people with a pre-existing condition, what would they pay basically to get rid of it? And now that inertia effect becomes important. So in order to be able to get them to change, we need to get a big enough number of years across, give them enough years to actually overcome the inertia effect, and then they'll be in the market. So now I can talk about willingness to pay for a pill for a particular duration. And so these are going to be, this magic, non-existent, hypothetical pill is going to deliver for you 1 year of relief, 10 years of relief, 20 years of relief. And then we're going to ask the same question. Who will be prepared to pay, and how much would you be prepared to pay for this, depending upon your severity of your condition? So if somebody's developed this pill and it's basically just giving you 1 year's relief, and then you're back to where you were before, the only people who are going to be willing to come into the market are the people who are here up on this extreme level of the condition, who are absolutely scoring maxed out effectively on everything. They are prepared to come in and actually say, yep, I'm prepared to pay this by this. But anybody beneath that level of severity is basically not prepared to pay for 1 year's worth of relief. If you say, well, this pill delivers you 10 years of relief, then it's starting to look like a more attractive option, because the extra 10 years, I tackled this thing about how many years do I have to offer people. If I offer them 10 years of relief, now I can overcome the inertia factor for everybody who's up to the first, who's beyond the 1 standard deviation on the condition. But beneath that, there's still a lot of people out there who aren't. And then if it's 20 years, actually it sort of moves back in again. Half a standard deviation, I can get people into the market. So these, yes, the FAC index is being normalized on the average of the condition. So then the question is, okay, no, that's it's the average of the people, it's the median of the people with problems. So then you can ask that. It's doing really well in prompting with questions, which immediately lead to the next lead me to the next slide. So it's interesting to know, but the question is, okay, well, what proportion of people are actually across this distribution, as in presumably not very many sitting out there at the +2 level. So what we can do is actually work out a market share. So instead of thinking about willingness to pay, let's use our model to predict the proportion of the population who would come in and actually purchase this pill out of the total population with the condition, given the distribution of the condition. So in the first panel, again, it's a 1 year effect of the pill. And now we're varying the prices, and we're seeing what proportion of people we can get in depending upon what their condition is. And what you can see is that even at a very low effectively zero price. For 1 year's relief, we'd only get 35% of the market coming in. That, as you go through, and the scales on these are changing, so you can actually, I could probably standardize them, but the next one is going up to 0.4, the next one's going up to 0.5. But so as we're increasing the number of years that the pill is giving you relief, it increases the baseline, if you like, market, but then as you charge more for the pill, obviously the market falls away. So for the fact, as in you're going to struggle to get half of the population in buying into this product, even if you're giving it away free. And these, I'm not showing you the graphs for all the other conditions, no, not enough time, but they basically show the same sort of pattern. So this is a bit interesting. Apparently, we normally think that if you give people free goods, that they say yes to them. So we normally assume, and we would normally assume that having release from this condition would be seen as being a good thing. So why is it that in our responses that people are giving to this, apparently they are not willing to take a free good, or wouldn't be prepared to take a free good, which removes them from this condition? What's going on? Well, you may just think this is just either wrong or statistically we just screwed up or something. But if you go back into the data and look at non-participation, we've got two types of definition of non-participation. The first one is that just in the choice sets, they never pay to remove the condition. So they're in the choice sets, but they never agreed to actually any of the options with the payment vehicle. And then we asked them, so the payments ranged across quite a wide range, so there'd have been some cheap options in there for them. We asked the usual follow-ups. We noticed you never chose to pay for the pill. Why was that? And there were a few people who would have given us some, if you like, protest answers, things like, I don't believe the pill would work, or stuff like that. So that's about 4%. I've given the parents one. About the same amount of people were having this non-participation behavior. But we then also had this type of behavior which we found in the data, which I'm calling type 2, where they would never remove the condition even if it was free. And we identified this by the warm-up questions that we were asking in the choice sets. So in order just to get people used to this idea, okay, you're going to have to be presented with these choices, and we're going to give some options, and this is the type of thing you're going to see. We showed them this, and they were like training sets, but they didn't have a cost in. It just said, okay, this is what we're going to sort of see. No change, stay as you are. Or you could have a pill which would give you this release. It's going to last for 20 years. And then there was another warm-up which said, okay, would you pay for it? So they were being sort of led into the idea of understanding how these figures worked, and the trade-off on years and then cost. We're doing all the good stuff. And what happened was they had 3 of these training sets and 0 cost of removing the health condition for various durations of 1, 5, and 20. And what we're finding in those questions, as in never removing the condition even if free, adults, 11% declined all 3 of those amounts, even up to 20 years. They wouldn't want to remove it. And then went in and said, okay, what would happen if we gave you permanent removal of your condition? 55% needed actually permanent removal. 35% declined permanent removal, as in they just didn't want to get rid of it. And I think the debriefing on those questions were things like, well, I've got used to it. I've learned how to live with not eating dairy, or whatever it might be. I was talking to somebody here whose kid has got an allergy, and they were saying, I'd be really worried if it was removed, that in some sense it came back and they weren't trained to understand how this was going to work. As in, so I don't want short periods of removal, because they're going to be released and back out into the world of eating pizzas or whatever, and then, okay, you're now having to switch it all back again, and now they have to go back to their constrained life. I don't want to make those transitions. So they were almost literally describing stasis, a condition of saying, I don't want to actually do the cost of adjustment of moving from one condition to another. So although it looks a bit odd, there seems to be something happening in terms of the way people are thinking about their conditions and how they're responding to it, which does seem to suggest that they don't want these short periods of relief from this type of condition, some people don't, which is interesting. But the parents, okay, same thing, if anything bigger. Okay, so that's an interesting thing in terms of the results. And those results come out of however we estimate the model. That's the same sort of things coming. Okay. Thank you, Dan, for pointing out my joke. You were supposed to get it on your own. Okay, so I want to go back now and think about estimation. I want to talk a bit about what's happening inside these results as to what we're getting out of the hybrid models. There's another interesting thing that's emerging out of this apart from the non-participation. So if you just look at the results as they get spat out of Stata, this is the choice experiment results. Normal things, coefficients, is thus the years, the cost, yada, yada, yada. Remember I said that we're going to do this with latent, with ordered logit models for doing the conditions. So basically, we need to have cut points. For those of you who know about ordered logits, you have to decide at what point does the function get cut. So they're giving us a 0 versus a 1 versus a 2 versus, so that's what, and you get masses of those. One of these for each of the questions. So you see FAC 11, FAC 1, that's just the code for which question they've answered and where the cut points are. But then what you also get are these weights, and these are the coefficients on these sort of arrows coming down, the yellow arrows. So what I said was, well, I'm going to have this 29 different ordered logit models which explain the relationship between their underlying condition and the responses they were giving on the indicator. So there's a whole stack of those. I should have 29 lines coming down. Well, basically, what this set of results is showing, it's only a fragment. This goes on for about 3 more pages. It shows you what the weight is that's being, or the relationship that's being estimated between the latent variable, here called L1, and the answer they were given on that condition, on that question. We have to constrain one of them to equal 1 for identification, and I've constrained it so that the thing with the biggest weight is constrained to be equal to 1. So everything else is going to be smaller than 1. And what's interesting, as in these are unconstrained, it can estimate any value it wants. What's getting interesting is that these are not coming up as 1. It's saying that the relationship between my underlying condition that I've got and the answers I was giving to all of those little bank of questions is not consistently as powerful for some questions as others. So the one where it's sort of the biggest effect is 11. FAC 5 is also quite close to 1, but there are some which are starting to move quite a long way away. And rather than plow through tables, let's do a graph. So this is the one for FAC. So the one with the biggest weight is normalized to 1, and now this is the relative weight that's attached to all the other questions. It's been ordered, so I've just ordered it so you get the nice pattern. But what you can see is there's quite a wide spread across this, and in particular, there's a couple down here which are saying there isn't a very strong relationship between the condition I've got and the way I've answered those questions, because I'm down at sort of 0.3, 0.25, 0.3 for those. Others have actually sort of grouped more higher up as a weight of 1, but I'm not getting the same, an equal weight across all of them. And you do that, that's for the celiacs, the same thing, it's normalized from 1 and it drops away, not as bad, it only goes down to 4. This is the FIC, the intolerances, okay, normalized at 1 again on the right-hand side, then it drops away, it's back down at 0.2. So this seems quite interesting. It's basically saying that what was happening before when people were using this big bank of questions is in order to work out their condition, they were just averaging the score across everything, as if they all contributed equally to my measure of my severity. Whereas this suggests that actually some of these things aren't that important to people. Okay, I do know, as in I've got a crib sheet. Okay, for the FAC one, the ones which are down here at 0.2 and 0.3, those were about the trouble from it being unclear to which foods you're allergic to, and the trouble with lettering on labels being too small. So this is about how important are these things in determining my index. They're effectively saying that actually these don't seem to be very strongly weighted with the average. They're actually sort of weighted quite low. The ones that are at the top are all about eating out. So you're getting some sense as to what it actually is amongst these items. They're not all equally important when you have this big bank of questions. Some things are more important than others. So that seems interesting. Where have I got? Oh, I need to do it. Okay. My favorite slide. Is this worth doing? As in, so should we have gone through this process? And there's a whole parallel set of stuff going on with a mixed logit model doing exactly the same results, not doing all this fancy hybrid stuff. Okay. On the horizontal axis, it's just the FAC as calculated by the standard process, the standard weights. It actually goes from 1 to 7 in their normalization. On the vertical axis, it's the new weighted one out of the SEM, where we're using our new weights. They're different, obviously, because we're actually weighting things lower, but actually, that looks pretty much like a straight line. There's not a huge variation. And then we can do it for CDQs, and we can use it for fix. So that was, when I spat those out, it was a bit depressing. Because it's sort of, you'd like to think, okay, there's going to be a change, that was going to be some impact. Actually, it doesn't seem to be working out very well. Our weights are the weights that we've estimated in the model. The model has told us how much the equivalent weight is of each of the items. So the two ones about labeling or whatever, they were given weights of 0.2 when we added it up across all a person's scored. Yeah. Which is how the standard one is generated. It's just a comparison thing. So then you can go back in and you can look at the willingness to pay. So ML stands for mixed logit. The SEM one is the estimates we're getting out of the model. And this is sort of like the pieces of the willingness to pay. So this is just the coefficients divided by the cost coefficient, and for whether or not it's got the interaction term on the years and the interaction term on the ASC. In some sense, it's what you would use, the building blocks that you would use to build a willingness to pay for a particular product. And you compare those across, and there are some differences, but not hugely different. Well, the SEM ones look as if I might make an argument that for the fact that they're smaller. Did I do this for everybody? I think I did for everybody. That's for the celiacs. Okay, the SEM effect isn't smaller in here, so I have not got a consistent story about, but they're all looking pretty much in the same ballpark. And that's for the intolerances, again, pretty much the same ballpark. A bit of a difference there between on the years one, so that's the consequence of the index, a shift in the index on the willingness to pay for a year's worth of relief. So slightly more, a bigger impact for the SEM model. That's for a 1 standard deviation shift in the index. But in terms of, if you said, is this going to have a huge impact in terms of policy implications, you'd probably say no. Okay, conclusions. Am I going to get on? Yeah. So first time that we think that people have looked at valuing food hypersensitivities. The estimates look plausible in the sense that they don't go in terms of massively huge values or ridiculously small. They look like sort of fairly reasonable ones to get rid of these quite serious conditions, given that they were one-off payments, possibly for quite large periods of relief. Low rates of classic non-participation. Looks as if there's this new form of non-participation, which is about, not about stasis and not wanting to actually It's not as if you're worried about the pill. It's just as if I don't want to have a short period of release from this and then you give it back to me. So it's not as if there's no transactions costs of moving from one state to the other. Give me enough time, I might be in, but I'm not doing it for a year. And although theoretically correct, the hybrid model doesn't seem to make a huge difference in the results, in terms of the policy result, which in a way is interesting. Negative conclusions are still conclusions, but that's what it seems to pop out for us. It's available. Well, the base model is available. The SEM stuff isn't available. That's all coming new, but the base stuff is all available through the FSA's website. So thank you very much.
So before you started talking about the reasons that people have given for not buying in, sticking with the status quo, I was wondering about sort of something akin to anti-vaxxers, where you might have an aversion to taking on a new unknown medicine, or just saying, I'm not just going to take any old medicine, you know, until it's been proven, or it's been proven to be safe, or ever. I would never trust it to be safe because I just don't trust the medical system. But it doesn't sound like that was a huge part of what you found.
No, because those should be people who are in the non-participation. Those people are in the protest non-participation. I don't trust the pill the other way. Whereas these guys who are in here are, in some sense, they are in the group which are potentially making trade-offs. Some across, but you really need to give them. Then they're not at all impressed by a small number of years, even if it's fairly cheap.
The numbers on. I'm just looking at the debrief questions about why this taking the pill. I did not trust its safety with only 9 people. So I did not trust it to work with only 10 people. So
We were convincing and saying this is a pill that would work. Hypothetically, there's a pill that would work. I'll start with you, because I'll work up the room.
Okay. Remind me to talk to you about adding extra columns to your model comparison later, like more models, because I've been wanting to do something to add to what you're doing for a long time. I think you could have more comparisons, but I don't want to bore everyone. I'm wondering, so your sample, it seemed to be people who knew they had a specific food hypersensitivity. So I wonder if that explains why a lot of people are not willing to pay for the pill. So I'm thinking about this search cost. So I'm speaking from this, like knowing a few people who've gone through all of this, a few people who haven't gone through all this process, right? You have to go to so many doctors, try all these diets out. It's a huge search cost to figure out what your food sensitivity is. And then you adjust to it and you live your new happy life. Yeah. And I'm wondering if you could include people in the sample who essentially had the same severity of symptoms but didn't know what their food severity or what was causing their problem, I would assume willingness to pay would go up. I'm assuming there's a lot of people out there who suffer but aren't willing to go through the thousands of dollars and all of the appointments in 5 years to figure out their sensitivity.
But we're giving them this for free without having to do any search cost. As in,
but I guess what I'm trying to say is you've sampled people who've done search costs already to get into your survey, probably. Like they know I have hypersensitivity to these food groups. Whereas I would argue that probably more people don't go through that search.
They may not have been clinically diagnosed. This may, I'm not looking at the back of the room, these may include groups of people who have self-reported themselves that I've got this condition, and they will be a member of the support group, but they not necessarily, I think everybody had got a clinical evaluation. And yes, and so it was generic. It was just, do you have an allergies? Do you have an intolerance or whatever to foods? And explain what those were. But it could be anything as to what they're intolerant to. Yeah. You know, onions or whatever, or dairy or whatever. So they're all mixed in. So there's no differentiation between them. And is a degree of self-identification that you have this condition.
Yeah. I guess I'm thinking that if anything, this is like a low-end estimate of how much people are willing to pay, depending, because I would assume there's a lot of people who just would pay for the pill if it also meant not having to go through the search. Right?
Oh, well, yeah, well, yes. So, but you don't need to go through the search because apparently all your symptoms have gone. So
Yeah.
you're now free and can live a pizza-eating life as you want to live. I can't remember what the proportions were who had.
So there's a mix of people who were recruited from the sort of support groups of the screenshot, the realities, and we'll see that those really unaware linked food intolerances to this bit of a general term. Some of those were clinically diagnosed, some of them weren't. But then some of the sample came from a general market research.
That's
and
right.
it was just a screening question saying, do you have one of these things? So those people may not have. But you might think the people involved in who have signed up members of those support groups might be this part of the distribution which is more severe because it might be about other things which makes it get involved, but that might be one relationship.
I think it's just a thing where it's probably severe for a lot of people, but they're not doing anything about it. And I think if you could somehow tap into those people, the value would be a lot higher.
Yes. So I suppose with these conditions, it can be severe, but I don't experience it because I've worked out what it is and I'm just avoiding it. I know that if I eat onions or marriage or whatever. Well, it's because they have worked out how to live their life without eating this, and they're sort of saying, I've got a perfectly good life. Why do I need to change this? I've learned how to live with this. It's not actually causing me much problems, but I know.
Changes to the willingness to pay to eat onions.
Exactly.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
Whereas
some people live with celiac disease not knowing what it is for 20 years.
Yeah.
And I would think that they're going to have a higher willingness to pay, saying, why do I feel terrible? I don't know. And I would, if I could have a pill to make this go away, I would pay more probably, rather than saying,
we could. I'm going to stop this because you can.
Yeah, sure.
Attacker had a question. I'm going to.
Willingness to pay for the status quo and the confusing, but that's not my question now. I would have just liked everything for one way. So the results you described as depressing, they didn't seem to be the sophisticated model didn't seem to make a difference. I think is that partly or mostly related to the fact that the people who built up set up the indicators have done a good job.
Possibly.
If it had been just a set of indicators that were that good, made by somebody who amateur, probably you would find a huge difference. That's what I would say.
So I think the reason that these are lining up so much, even though we're doing the reweighting, is because there's so many questions in here. So if you're just reweighting part of them, it just sort of gets washed out because, okay, you shouldn't have been putting a weight of 1 on labels being too small, but when you rejig that weight, the rest of it is still just driving you along and putting you in the same place. So I think that's partly that what's driving this is just the number of items that are turning up in the index. And then the issue of bias, it's true, as in the greater the sort of measurement error, the variability in the measurement that you've got is going to cause the problem of bias. So you can just think of this asymptoting, so that if at some point the index asymptotes to certainty, then the problem's gone away. So the problem gets bigger, the bigger the measurement error that you've got. So it could be true that they have worked on these and that these are largely aligned in terms of the values, and therefore, as a result, we're not seeing big shifts in the values. So yes, okay. Yeah. So what we could do is just take a subset of the numbers, take 5 of the questions, rerun everything and say, if you only asked 5 questions of everybody and you treated them as certain rather than would this change? Okay. That's another paper. Yeah, go.
Anna, would you like to unmute yourself and ask questions?
Yeah, sure. I was wondering whether you saw any differences depending on the recruitment method, and if the people who you said they were perfectly happy because they've learned to manage the condition, then why would they join support groups? And related to that, did you see or think there could be any effects that people, like, once they learn to manage, they're actually happier? And if they didn't have the condition, in the sense that now they've learned to have healthier diets, they may got used to eating more fruit and vegetable, and they think, oh, if I didn't have the condition, I'd probably just be indulging on like pizzas and healthy food. So in a way, they've learned to see the condition as a blessing in disguise.
Yeah, the first one I think goes to the point that I made, as in that it is like it's possible that the people who are coming in through, who aren't members of the panels, may well be at the lower end of the distribution. I can't remember if we ever looked at that, but I think that which is probably a good thing in the sense we probably got a better distribution by doing the 2 recruitment methods, but I think that's true. The issue about whether or not they've realized that this enforced change has actually improved their life, well, you'd have thought they'd be indifferent about the condition then, as in that they, yeah, because didn't come out in the focus groups.
Came out in the focus groups in terms of people's problem with changes of non-permanent changes being the idea of having to adjust back.
Yeah.
But not in terms of it. I'm actually happier.
But happier, yes. So,
but I'm saying like that contributes to that sunken, that inertia. They say like the benefits need to be much bigger because it's not all bad. I'm just wondering whether this can explain part of that. So I don't think unwillingness to get out of the condition as well as coming back. But if you said it didn't come up in the focus group, then that's
I don't think we've got any evidence to think that people. This is actually a good thing. I'm now off dairy, so my cholesterol's better.
Yep. Thanks for that.
We didn't. I don't think we saw that, but it'd be an interesting thing to possibly dig into.
Thanks.
Okay.
Great study. Thanks. At this study, remind me of that one that you presented once, where at the end of the problem they were told, and then you die.
Yes, this is the follow-on. These guys don't have that condition, that problem. So, is there anybody else online? Okay, I think we should wrap it up, given we've been having conversations about keeping things to time when we're in rooms.